Well, I often describe the Cuyahoga Valley as a great green garden lying along 20 miles of the Cuyahoga River between the cities of Akron and Cleveland. It's a beautiful, beautiful, lush green valley, 33,000 acres, and just filled with beautiful historic buildings and wildlife and plant life that is native to Ohio, and it's really just a beautiful, beautiful setting, and really one of the very fine units of the national park system. Well, you know, we're not distinguished by geysers and mountains and great canyons, but it's an example of a national park which is intended to preserve what I would call a vernacular landscape, a true American landscape here in the valley. And frankly, there are a lot of other parks which resemble the Cuyahoga Valley in a general sense around the country. Places like the Buffalo River, the Delaware Water Gap, the Chattahoochee Recreation Area down in Atlanta. So we have relatives throughout the national park system that are similar to this park. You know, one of the interesting things about this park is that while we are located in an urban area, probably more than half of the units of the national park system, of the 391 units, are located in urban areas. So it's by no means the only park that's located in an urban area. But if you were expecting to find a park where the city crowds right up to the valley, not exactly. It's a very bucolic, pastoral setting, really quite a wonderful natural area lying between Cleveland to the north and Akron to the south. The boundaries of this park were determined back in the pre-legislative days of the park. There was an awful lot of study done of where the boundaries of the park ought to be. And although it was well before my time, it's clear that it was a combination of trying to capture within the park boundaries the most important resources of the valley, the historic resources, the natural resources, the cultural and archaeological resources, but tempered by political considerations. In one of the early bills that John Seiberling sought for this park, the park was actually considered to run south of Akron and down towards Canton, but that was thought of as being a little too politically aggressive, so they settled in on this 20 miles of area essentially between the two cities. Land acquisition in the Cuyahoga Valley was a very challenging undertaking. Essentially what Congress did was draw a line around 33,000 acres of land along the Cuyahoga River here in Summit and Cuyahoga counties and said this will someday become a part of the national park. And private ownership within that area, that 33,000 acre, was identified for potential acquisition. So in the early days of the park, the National Park Service contracted with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to handle the bulk of the early and really massive undertaking of acquiring land within the Cuyahoga Valley. So the Army Corps was here for 2 years. I think the Park Service found that that didn't work as well as they hoped it would. The Army Corps was not particularly sensitive about landowner issues and interests, and the Park Service shifted away from the use of the Army Corps and began to handle land acquisition in its own right. The way the legislation was set up, if you owned a home in the Cuyahoga Valley and that home existed as of the date of the passage of legislation, you were guaranteed, if the National Park Service did acquire your property, you would have the right to what was called either a life estate, which meant that you and your spouse could retain the property for so long as you lived, even if it were acquired by the Park Service, or something called a term retention, where you could elect to retain private use of the property for your selected number of years from 1 up to 25. If you wanted more than 25 years, then you would select the life estate. So that was intended to soften the impact of federal land acquisition on the valley, although it's a fair statement that this park in its early years did become quite controversial, and it was I think a very difficult process of acquiring private property to create this unit of the National Park System. And that's a story, by the way, which has been repeated many times around the National Park System. It's not easy developing and forming a new unit of the National Park System. While we understand the Park Service was criticized in many places for land acquisition, as you look at what has been done today, where we stand today, I think most people feel very good that these lands were protected and acquired while they were able to be acquired. There's no question, for instance, in the Cuyahoga Valley, that this valley would have been steamrolled by development had this land not been acquired by the National Park Service. You see it today in the approach roads coming into the valley. The subdivisions march right up to park boundaries. There would have been very heavy commercial and residential development of the valley. It would, in effect, have been largely paved over and lost to development, which would have been a tragedy for not only people of this region, but I think, in one sense, for all Americans. There was a very avid group of local individuals in the 1980s who surfaced first to help the National Park Service plan trail development in the Cuyahoga Valley. They came together under the name of the Cuyahoga Valley Trails Council, and their first real product was to assist the Park Service in developing a Cuyahoga Valley Trails plan. Once that plan was approved and adopted, then that organization re-engineered themselves to become a trail construction crew. And they have been out there ever since, building trails in the Cuyahoga Valley, and then once they're built, those same volunteers help us maintain the trails. So we have any number of different sort of subgroups of the Trail Council who focus on individual trail maintenance, individual trail patrol, and then we have a couple different groups whose focus is entirely the Ohio and Erie Canal Towpath Trail, the Towpath Trailblazers, who help us maintain and patrol the 20 miles of the towpath.